Hey, it's Debbie, and I am bringing on Joe Friel. He's the author of this book you might have seen before. It's been around, many editions of it. The Triathlon Bible, the ultimate guide for aspiring and experienced triathletes. But you don't have to be a triathlete to listen to this show. We are going to talk to Joe Friel about how to do field testing to figure out your swim pace, your bike pace, FTP versus heart rate versus lactate versus VO2 max, and your run pace, all in the book. So be sure to order your book and learn from Joe Friel. He's the best-selling author of the Cyclist Training Bible, Fast After 50, Going Long, Your Best Triathlon, Your First Triathlon. His training Bible coaching service is one of the most successful and respected in endurance sports. He's been an athlete in an endurance world since 1980, and he's still training. I had to record a podcast with him in the afternoon because the morning's devoted to working out. So good for him. This book is a Bible. And as I use coaching clients and I look at their strength training program and their heart rate zones and strength exercises are in here, pacing, heart rate variability, rest and recover, which people don't do enough of, and more. You can learn so much in here. I haven't read it beginning to end. It's kind of one of those books I kind of jump around a lot. But off-season training is about here as we record this, and building your fitness, your base in the off season is often where we need to start. And if you've listened to my podcast episodes 12 years ago, with Phil Maffetone, we talk about the max aerobic function heart rate, how to be fat adapted. We started this show in 2010 or 2012, I forget, about how to use fat for fuel. And as an endurance athlete, we're going for the long haul. It's burning the slow burning big fat log in your fire versus kindling that you need to keep refilling your fire to keep it burning. We want the slow burning log in your fireplace, kind of what we're talking about. Fat fuel versus carbohydrate fuel. How do you train? I'll do lots of extra videos coming up the next month about how much time in zone two. What is zone two? Are you even in zone two? It's about your fuel source used in zone two. So if you can ideally do a metabolism test as Pinoy with me, North San Diego, Del Mar, Solana Beach, I do testing, then we figure out your fat oxidation rates. If you are doing a lactate testing threshold to figure out your zone two, you're really guessing of where you burn the most fat because you're not testing that, you're testing lactate. And so that's an estimate. If you're doing your pace of your heart rate zones based on a percentage of your VO2 max, well, that VO2 max, I bet you didn't go to your max on that test unless you have done a few tests. Most people get to peak VO2. So if your VO2 max percentages defined your 5 training zones is based on a number that's not actually your true max heart rate, you're also just guessing where your fat burning zone is, where your interval training zones are 4 and 5, and where your recovery zone is 1. Test and not guess. But if you can't get access to a Pinoy metabolism test or someone else that can do testing to know your fuel sources in each training zone, Joe Friel is coming back on the podcast today to talk about how you can do some other tests that are still guessing, but at least give you an idea of where you are. And then how often should you retest? I say every 3 months to know, all right, we've set the bar a little higher now. You've improved that fat burning engine. Let's see how high we can get that crossover point from your carbs to fat. Otherwise, you can talk the Maffetone method and Joe Friel's book. You can go back and read all these good options in here. So let's bring on Joe and learn more about how to test for your training zones. All right, I have the master on the show to talk to you about all these questions I keep emailing him about. So I thought I'd just have Joe Friel back on the podcast to do a little deeper dive into specific topic that I keep talking about, testing and not guessing. But what if you can't have access to metabolism tests as I do in North San Diego? And Joe's an expert. If you've read his book or haven't, you got to get his book to go over all the options. So, Joe, you're going to answer some questions and clear up some confusion of how we should pace ourselves for training for endurance events. So,
Happy to do it, Debbie. Thanks for asking me to talk to you.
what are your biggest questions you get on training intensity? Maybe start there.
You're breaking up. I'm sorry. I couldn't get the
What are the
question.
common questions you get on training intensity?
Oh, a common question about intensity. Yeah, it's the most common question has to do with how do you do a field test for it. I get that question probably once a week from somebody,
Okay.
and they're confused because they've read so many things about how to do the testing, field testing, that they don't know which thing to do. I just got one yesterday. The guy said, went through all the things he heard. He wasn't sure what to do. And quite honestly, when you're field testing, you're not going to get a perfect number anyway. So just choose one of the ways of doing it and stick with that thing all the time. Just always use that same test and you'll be fine. You may not have a perfect number, but there is no perfection when it comes to this anyway, because intensity changes from day to day just because of fatigue and lack of sleep, or you had a great night of sleep, or whatever it may be, you had a hard day at work. And so all these things affect the intensity of your training. So just choose one way of testing, field testing, and stick with it.
One way, and then how often should we retest?
Oh, for field testing, I would suggest somewhere between 6 and 8 weeks for field testing. Lab testing might do a little bit differently, but field testing, the thing is that with field testing, it's kind of like doing a really hard workout in a way. In fact, it is. And so it becomes just another workout for you, and it's a really challenging workout. So that's beneficial. And you're going to do it at the end. I would have the athlete do it at the end of a rest week, so you come into the test fresh and ready to go. And so you kind of start off this next couple of weeks with having done a hard effort. So I think 6 to 8 weeks is going to work out pretty well for most athletes.
Okay, so 6 to 8 weeks. What if you are just starting out or we're starting into off season? Hopefully people have an off season because I used to end up training year round. So off season, we want to get a good idea of where we are. And if we're trying to build a base, what should we start with doing for swimming, for example?
Yeah, well, you want to be able to set up training zones. So you know if you're doing the training you should be doing. And we're trying to build a base. The zones we're focused on are zones 1 and 2 in a 5-zone system, which is what I suggest in the book. And so zones 1 and 2 is what you want to be doing. And that will help you to do all the things, all the benefits that come from aerobic training, building a base, in other words, are done in zones 1 and 2. So once you find your zone system, set your zones up, know how to have the whole thing worked out for every sport, then just focus on zones 1 and 2. That's really the key to it.
Mm-hmm. Why do we need to focus on zone 1 and 2?
Well, what we're trying to do primarily is to build the aerobic system. And that's a very broad statement. Everybody in sport, endurance sports, has heard this so many times. It's kind of like you just shut off when you hear the words aerobic endurance and the aerobic system. But people don't really appreciate what it's all about. I'm afraid that people kind of take it for granted. They think, well, if I'm an endurance athlete, therefore my aerobic endurance is fine. I don't need to worry about it. It'll take care of itself. All I have to do is make sure I do a lot of hard workouts. And that's exactly the wrong opinion to take. The best athletes in the world do not do that. They don't do this hammer every day. Instead of going zone 2, I'm going to go in zone 3. Instead of zone 3, I'm going to go in zone 4. That's not the way the best athletes do it. It's not going to get you where you think it's going to get you. It's just not going to pay off. What you have to be able to do is you need to be in zones 1 and 2 to build aerobic endurance. Once you get out of zone 2, moving to zone 3, 4, etc., you're no longer working on aerobic endurance. It's not the same thing. You're not getting the same benefits. And the list of benefits is extremely long. We haven't got time to go into all the benefits that come from aerobic endurance training, but they're very important and they have to do also with your high intensity training. For example, when you train it, I'll just give you one example of how this helps you to go faster at race speed. Let's take like an Olympic distance race. If you know your zones and you train in zone 1 and 2 and you stay there a lot, one of the things that happens is you begin to cause the body to produce what's called a carrier, a protein carrier called MCT1. And this MCT1, what it does is it grabs the lactate that you're producing during exercise, takes it into the muscle, and then causes that lactate to be used to produce more energy. In other words, it becomes another form of energy besides fat and carbohydrate. So you've got this third source, but if you don't do aerobic endurance training, you lose out on that benefit because you can't produce the MCT1. So you got to be able to you have to do aerobic endurance training to be able to reap all the benefits for your high endurance training. So that's why we always start with aerobic endurance every season.
Is that the same for women? Men and
Same
women
for
the same?
every human has the very same situation. You gotta keep using that lactate to produce more energy, and the way you do that is by training in zones 1 and 2.
Yeah, I know Stacy Sims has spoken on that topic for the females, not the same as the male, and that women don't need as much zone 2 than men because at birth we're better at endurance, we have more slow twitch muscle fibers. And she also talks about that pathway for lactate shedding that men have it. Is it men have it better that we have to train differently to improve that lactate doing sprint interval training?
That's good. That's an interesting
Data?
point. I've never heard that before. I need to look that up to find out there's more details here. But I would suggest that we're not that far apart, females and males, when it comes to our systems or how our bodies function, physiologically function.
Yeah.
And so this is one thing I think that needs to be taken advantage of by athletes, regardless of age, regardless of gender. You need to be able to improve your aerobic endurance, therefore to improve your anaerobic endurance, if you want to use that word anaerobic, which is not a very good word.
I
If you
know.
want to go fast, you need to be able to go slow to get there. How much, I don't know exactly, but that's probably going to be determined by the individual.
Okay. Yeah, and I think that's two things. What Stacy Sims, and I can send you the blog she has on that. But she's not talking to the endurance athletes. I think you have to read things and go, okay, women don't need as much zone 2 than men. Well, I do metabolism testing and I can say that we can determine if you need more in zone 2 than others, because a lot of people don't have a great zone 2. And also, if you're not training for endurance event, we don't need maybe as much time in zone 2 unless we're training for a long distance race. Do you think it matters if we're just looking at longevity versus performance gains or fat loss?
Well, both things are necessary for longevity. Also, there's research that show both of those are effective for keeping us healthy for many years. And I just read the other day, there was research study showing that some high intensity training has been shown to prevent dementia, or at least offset the possibility of dementia. So some high intensity training is good for everybody, but also the same with low intensity training. It's good for everybody also.
Yeah. And the other thing I was going to add in that we'll get into the different testing for zones per sport, but I think it's funny every time I read articles, but now when they say aerobic versus anaerobic, and then there's always the lactate acid. We'll go back to and talk about that a little bit more, but it's funny because now it's like, well, it's not aerobic versus anaerobic. We're not supposed to say that anymore. So it's just funny how probably through your many editions of your book, how so much has evolved over the years of, okay, we're really not aerobic or anaerobic. There's always a combination. We're not really having the lactic acid burn fatigue that we always talked about. So there's a lot of changes in our terminology of fueling and metabolism as we perform.
Yeah, exactly right. When I started, I started as an athlete back in the 1960s. And at that time, lactic acid was considered to be like a byproduct, a waste byproduct of exercise. And it caused soreness and it caused fatigue. And in fact, that theory, that way of seeing this whole subject goes back to the 1920s. I think it was 1924 at Harvard when one of the professors there came up with this idea that the stuff he called lactic acid caused muscles to fatigue. And we now know that's malarkey. It doesn't happen that way. But for 100 years ago, that's who knows? Because there wasn't a whole lot of research to work from or
Mhm.
equipment to use to even do the testing. This was a lot of stuff just being done by the seat of your pants. And so consequently, that's what he came up with, and it's still to this day considered to be the way it is. If you listen to any athletic event on TV, if you watch an Ironman coverage on TV, if you watch the Tour de France on TV, at some point I will guarantee you the announcer, the speaker will talk about lactic acid, and these guys are slowing down now because lactic acid is building up. It's causing them to become fatigued. So this thing is never going to end because it's got media behind it now. People don't know anything are talking about it all the time. So consequently, on TV, everybody thinks this is the way it must be in real life, but it's not. There's no such thing as lactic acid. And it doesn't do, and stuff called lactate doesn't do what we think it does, had used to do, think also. It doesn't cause fatigue, it doesn't cause muscle soreness. In fact, it's
Yeah,
beneficial.
well, you talked about that in your book in a section. I know we talked about in the last podcast, but is it just a good summary of how lactate is used as a fuel and lactate testing? Maybe we start with that method of testing since we're speaking of lactate itself.
Yeah. Yeah, lactate testing is something that's got some real benefits to it. I think the difficulty of lactate testing is the learning curve. It's not the sort of, it looks like it ought to be easy. You just prick your finger or prick your earlobe and take a drop of blood and put in this little mechanical device, this little device, and it tells you what your lactate level is at this point in time. But it's not quite that simple. There's a lot of little details that go into how you collect that blood sample, and most people are going to screw it up if they do it. It's going to take a long time to get it right, and you're probably better off just guessing your lactate level than you are using it when you very first start. Because I almost guarantee you're going to get it wrong to begin with.
Mm.
But so one way of doing this is you can spend a long time figuring out how to do it yourself, or you can hire somebody to do it for you. You can go to somebody, a coach or a tester, at your if you belong to a health club or you have a coach or you know somebody at the university, you may be able to get the testing done there. There'll be a fee associated with that, which is the downside, of course. The upside is you get good data, some bad data. Testing is probably the best way to do it is to get some lactate testing done. There are lots of tests you can do though. It's not just lactate testing is the only thing there is out there. Right now, that's at the top of the list. And when everybody talks about testing, the very first thing that comes up is lactate testing.
Mhm.
And it's beneficial, but it's not the only way you can test.
Yeah, so that's one way, and people often talk about using that to determine their zones, their 5 training zones, because Peter Tia is the big one of it, talking lactate, and the 2.0 millimoles would be about your top of your zone 2. And then how would you figure out your 5 training zones with the lactate?
Well, so you just named lactate threshold 2 or lactate threshold 1,
1.
which is top of zone 2. And if you subtract about 10 beats per minute from that LT1 position, number of heartbeats you had at that level, that's going to give you the threshold for zone 1 to zone 2. So that's kind of puts you into, so now you have zones 1 and 2. We need to then find zone 3, 4, and 5. And so testing, you can do the same sort of testing to find lactate threshold 2, which is 4 millimoles of lactate. And that's going to be about the top of your zone 3. And if you add 10 beats onto that, you have the top of zone 4 and the remainder is zone 5. So it's not difficult to do. The math is actually quite easy, but realize there's some guesstimating going on here. This is not pure numbers, it's not pure science. We're coming up with a mathematical equation to figure out what the other zones are going to be besides the LT1 and LT2. But it's perhaps better, I won't say it is better, but perhaps better than field testing to get the same sort of information.
Mhm.
But it depends on who does the test. That's still the key.
Okay, good. And so we're guessing about fuel sources because really you want to know what fuel sources you're using to figure out your most accurate 5 training zones.
Right. You want to know what am I doing right now as far as carbohydrate and fat? What's the source of my energy when I'm training? What we want to be able to do is burn lots of fat. That's the key to becoming a good endurance athlete, is becoming very, very good at burning fat. If all you do is train high intensity, if that's the bulk of your training, zones 3 on up, if that's the bulk of your training, you're probably not very good at burning fat.
Mhm.
You need to get lots of zone 1 and 2, low intensity training. And when you do that, your body becomes extremely good at using fat for fuel. The high stuff makes you much better at using glycogen or sugar for fuel,
Yeah.
which we don't need any help with. We can get that very easily. That's no problem whatsoever. That's not anything you have to worry about training for. Training for burning fat is difficult, takes time, and you need to be very focused on that, especially early in the season.
Well, I feel bad. I have a lot of people that I test and they are training, spending all this time training and being consistent, but their zone 1 and zone 2's almost under 100 beats per minute, that they're so poor at burning fat because they're doing all 3 to 4, 5 zone training, burning carbohydrates, and they can stay there. And I go, well, it's because you're good at burning carbs.
Yeah.
It's amazing.
Yeah, this is really, if you want to come right down to it, you want to find the key to endurance sport, the key to endurance performance is being able to burn fat for fuel. That is the key. And if you avoid that by going to zones 3, 4, and 5 for almost all of your training, thinking that's going to make you faster because it feels hard, you're actually doing the worst thing you could be doing.
Mhm.
You're avoiding the most important thing, which is making sure you're really good at burning fat for fuel. That's the bottom line. We need to be very good at that.
I just realized it's 2024. It's October. I've been talking about this since I started Ironman's 2001, and then learning from Maffetone and Sally Edwards and you. So it's been like 20 plus years I've been saying the same thing. It's so crazy how people are still training for endurance sports, going to carb dependency fueling and carb burning training. That is even, I mean, you've been talking about this for 30 plus years. So has it
Yeah.
changed? Do you feel like people are understanding that more? Endurance is a fat burning, should be fat
Um,
burning?
well, I'm not sure where we are in the big picture and how many people percentage wise accept that as the gospel or not. But I would say we've made some headroads, or some little bit of an invasion into their way of seeing the world of sport. But that is indeed the key, and we need to be able to realize how important this is for our training. This is what the good athletes do. The good athletes are very good at burning fat for fuel. You can burn fat, you can burn sugar for fuel with absolutely no training whatsoever. You can go out and just burn immediately, come off the couch, and you start burning sugar for fuel. If you have somebody that's untrained, they're good at doing that, no problem whatsoever. The problem is that's a health problem. It
Mhm.
indicates there's a need for something to change. Or just as you mentioned a while ago, the athletes that you've tested, some have not been able to get above 100 beats per minute for zone 1 and zone 2. That's a sign of poor health, quite honestly.
Mhm.
They may have been training for some period of time and think they're healthy, but if that tells me they're not healthy, there's a real problem here. You're just not good at burning fat. And you've got to be good at burning fat to become a good endurance athlete. So there's no way to get around that. You can't, but it makes sense. When I was young, I thought this the very same way. If I want to get fast, I need to train fast all the time. So if I'm gonna get fast, I want to be in zone 3 as opposed to zone 2. That's faster.
Hmm.
Therefore,
Hmm.
I'm gonna become a better athlete. It doesn't work that way. That's not the way it works. Physiology isn't quite that simplified.
Yeah.
There's a little bit more to it than that. So you need to be, we keep saying this over and over, but you've got to become good at burning fat. You've got to train in zones 1 and 2. It needs to be the bulk of your training. Like 80% of your training needs to be in zones 1 and 2. That's like
Hmm.
almost all your training. And that's what the good athletes do. Find the
Because we
fast
get faster and faster and faster at those zones too, right? Our pace should
yeah,
get better.
exactly. Your speed, your power, things will improve at zone 2 if you train a lot in zones 1 and 2. You'll become faster at those zones. Your heart rate will be lower relative to your output,
Hmm.
your your speed or your power. Your
Yeah.
heart rate will be lower because of that. So that's the sort of thing you've got to really be focused on. Let's keep
Hmm.
driving it home.
Yes. 20 years. We're working on it still. All right. So going back to the swim, bike, run testing. So first, swimming. How do we test our pace swimming as endurance athletes? What's a field test?
Yeah, this is one that I've been doing with athletes for a long time. I started doing this, I think back in the 1980s is when I started, kind of came up with this idea. But basically what I have is the athlete do is swim 1,000 meters or 1,000 yards, depending on their pool, as fast as they can. It's time trial. Just like that 20-minute test we talked about for bike and run.
Hmm.
So it's a time trial. And then from that, we figured out what is the average 100 time. For 100, so in other words, 1/10 of whatever the time was is now what I call the T time. In other words,
Mm.
the threshold time, the time that we're going to focus on. And then all they do is they take that time and they go to my book and there's a table in there. And all they have to do is find their
Yeah.
time in the book, and it tells them what the zones are, what their pace is for each of the zones. So it's actually, the work is all done. You don't have to do any math at all. All you do is find
Yeah.
out what is your time and what is your time for 1,000 meters. Look it up on that table. I think it's like table 4.1 or 4.2. I think it's 4.2. Chapter 4, number page or table number 2, I believe is what it is. Um, I'll let you check that out. I don't have the book handy right here now.
Just looking. Chapter 4. Yeah. Oh, here. Yeah. 4.4.2, page 46.
Yep, there you go. That's the table. All you do is look up what your 1,000 meter time was, and it tells you what your zones are off to the right of that. So you got all your training zones set up from having done this 1,000 meter test. But realize that over time, hopefully, you'll get faster. And as you get faster, you need to retest. That's why we talked about 6 to 8 weeks a little while ago about the testing protocol, how often. So you come back to that test every 6 to 8 weeks or so and get an idea of where you are now. What should happen is, and this won't show up probably quite as well as swimming as it will for bike and run. What will happen is you will start going faster for the very same heart rate or very same effort. But probably effort is a better way to talk about it. You'll find you're swimming faster for the very same effort if you spend a lot of time working on zones 1 and 2 in the pool.
Hmm. Yeah. Swimming's more technical though. So it's if you have good form.
Exactly.
So you need those lessons too. And then I've struggled to count 1,000 meters, 1,000 yards. I need someone to count. Someone tell me, okay, you're done. That's your 1,000 meters. Going that long, I daydream
Yeah,
or
it's good
zone
to
out.
have somebody on the deck counting laps for you. Otherwise, you're probably going to lose track of where you were. It becomes a waste of time at that point.
Yeah. And so with swimming, with building endurance, I go to masters swimming a few days a week in Solana Beach, and I find Tuesdays we do long distance day, but other days, swimmers, it's interesting, people that are not endurance athletes that are grew up swimming or collegiate swimmers, they do everything hard. And their rest is like tightest interval possible, 1, 2 seconds and go, or 5 seconds rest. So I was interested, see your opinion if if swimming is really just kind of a zone 3 workout, or we're a lot of times in a master swim type of workout, if they're doing true intervals, we're not resting long enough to make it an interval. So it ends up being kind of zone 3, 4, not zone 1, 2.
Yeah. There's no problem with taking short recoveries. That just depends on what the workout is all about. Sometimes you want short recoveries, sometimes you want long recoveries. But I would suggest if you're doing something which is supposed to be like our zones 1 and 2 we've been talking about, that needs to be done the same way. So it's going to be done with relatively short recoveries because your heart rate's not all that high, the effort's not all that high. And so if you're going to take, you don't need to take recoveries on zone 1 and 2 swims.
No.
You can do them continuously. But if you're going to take recoveries, they're going to be relatively short recoveries. But the key to swimming for most triathletes really is not really highly dependent on their training zones. It's highly dependent on their skills. That's what's holding most triathletes back. Most age group triathletes are being held back by poor technique. That's the big issue. And for them, if they try to swim faster, all they're doing is creating more bubbles around themselves.
Yeah.
Nothing's happening. They're not going any faster, they're just getting more bubbles. So they got to learn to have good technique. And that's for most, what I always tell athletes when they say, how do I know if I need to work on my form or work on my fitness, fitness being something besides technique. I say, well, how fast do you swim 100 when you're swimming, in the pool? And if they say, well, it's slower, if it's less than 100 seconds per 100 meters, in other words, less than 100 a minute 40, if it's less or fast, I'm sorry, it takes longer than a minute 40, then you work on technique. That's just kind of like a standard rule I use. If you can't swim 100 and faster than 140, you need to work on your technique.
Yeah.
You can swim under 140, you can probably just now go back to working on training the normal way for like you do for running and cycling. But you got to get technique first. In fact, what I do with swimmers, what I've done with swimmers over the past, is I've had them most swimmers spend the entire winter just working on technique. We never do any intervals. We just spend the whole winter working on technique. So when they get to the spring, they're now ready to start doing some real training because they've got this thing figured out called technique. But until then, they're just wasting their time by trying to swim, hard workouts and so forth. It's a waste of time. So that's the key.
Okay. Yes. And I know TriDot does a swim school. So if people are looking for swim clinics, they do have that to improve your 100-meter split time. Their sales pitch is that you'll improve by the end of the weekend of swim school to improve.
Yeah, I hope so.
Okay. So biking, we hear a lot about watts, power meters, heart rate. Talk a little bit how to do field testing, FTP testing, and if that correlates to heart rate at all, anything on that area.
Yeah. I would suggest that if you're going to invest in something to become a better cyclist, it's a power meter. You can use heart rate, but it's not quite as precise as using a power meter is. It's kind of like pace in running. Pace is a little bit more precise than heart rate. Especially on a flat surface like a track or running a flat road. A different story when you start going uphill. But on the bike, it's essentially power is the key to becoming a better cyclist because you become focused on what it is you're trying to improve. I always break this down in two categories. Heart rate is a way of measuring effort. What you're feeling inside, the effort you're putting out. Power and pace, like in running, power is a measure of performance. What are you accomplishing? What are you actually doing? So we have two things there. We've got the internal systems that are working, the heart rate, which is telling us about effort, how hard we're working, and then we've got power, which is telling us what we're accomplishing with that effort. What's the effort accomplishing for us? And there's a whole, they could write an entire chapter in a book on just that one topic alone, because it's so critical to becoming a good athlete, especially on the bike. So we've got to become good at using a power meter. So we need to be able to find out what the zones are again. So we're kind of right back to the same place we started. Now when we have the athlete use that test, there's many tests here. But the most common one that people use is the 20-minute test. This is the one that Andy Coggan came up with many years ago. Still in use. It works. There are others. I've used a 30-minute test. I think it's a little bit better, but it's not a big deal. You can use one or the other. 20-minute means less suffering than 30 minutes does. So a 20-minute test involves warming up, good warm up, at least 20 minutes, probably 30 to 40 minutes is better. Gradually building intensity over the course of that period of time. And then on a relatively flat or slightly uphill course with no stop signs, no traffic lights, no very few intersections, light traffic, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Then you do a 20-minute time trial. You just ride as hard as you can for 20 minutes. Now, when I say that to an athlete, the first thing they do when they start the test is they go as hard as they could possibly go. And it doesn't work out because they're gonna fatigue within 10, 15 minutes, they're done already, and they slow down so much, the test is useless. So what I tell athletes to do is start out conservatively. Start out with something you know you can do. Easily, in fact. You know you can do it. And then at the end of that 5 minutes, decide, can I go a little bit harder or should I go a little bit slower? And for the next 5 minutes, do what you just decided. At the end of that 5 minutes, decide again to go a little bit faster or a little bit slower. Eventually, you'll be able to finish the 20 minutes and you'll have good data. But if you start out just trying to go as hard as you can, you're going to get worthless information, worthless data. So the test is a total waste. So if you do this, what happens is over time, as you do this test, this 20-minute test, you get better at figuring out what the pace should be. And so your test results become more accurate because of that, because you aren't going like this through the entire ride in this case. It's the same thing for the run. But you've got it figured out, so you know what the pace should be, and you hold that pace. So you get done, you cool down, you go back to your house, you download the information, and you look to see what was my power for 20 minutes. Now, when you look at your power on Training Peaks, you can get either average power or normalized power. There's two powers there. What you want to look at is average power. So look at the average power. That tells you what you accomplished during the ride on average. And then that becomes the focus then of trying to figure out your zones. So now we take that number and we can work out your zones from there on in. Again, there's a table that does this, certain percentages for each zone of that number. So what we found was essentially your threshold, LT2. Essentially, it's kind of like LT2. It's not exactly. It's kind of like LT2 that we talked about earlier. So we found that, and now you can work out all your zones based on that particular number, and that's, I think, table 4.1. So the very same chapter as before, only just a couple pages before. You'll find the formula for figuring all that out. So do that every 6 to 8 weeks and set up your zones, and then follow those zones for the next few weeks.
Have you ever correlated field tests to metabolism test in the lab to see if they're similar on their fat burning, peak fat oxidation rates and metabolic crossover point?
No, I have not, but I'm sure there are people who have.
That'd be me.
Yeah, I'm sure I'd be willing to bet that Alan Cousins has done that. Maybe Gordo Byrne also.
Gordo Byrne, I remember that name.
Yeah, there are people who are very into lactate testing and getting zones right. I suspect they've done that. I've not done it because I've never had the opportunity or never had the reason to do it. But it'd be very interesting information to have.
Didn't Gordo do training camp in Penticton every year and do lactate testing on everyone? Something. What did he do? I remember that
I'm not
name
sure
back in my race days.
he's a coach, has former coach. He may still coach. I'm not sure if he's still coaching or not, but he's at least a former coach. I've known him since 2000 is when we met, and he became a heck of an athlete, became a really good coach, and may still be coaching. I'm not sure about that. But he knows this information backwards and forwards in terms of lactate testing and setting up zones. I kind of suspect he's done that kind of testing before, both ways to compare them.
Yeah, because if you can do a metabolism test and really see if you're burning fat or carbs, I just feel like that's optimal versus the lactate testing part. I just still am like, well, if you can do the metabolism, wouldn't you rather do that versus a lactate test? Is just a guess.
Yeah, I think metabolism testing is great. Trying to find out how you're burning fat versus carbohydrate is what we're trying to find out there. And so you're doing it in a laboratory with a device that does all the testing for you. You don't have to go out on the road and try to figure out the pace as you're doing it. You just follow the instructions for the technician, and you wind up getting numbers about the same way, same type of information, but more accurate, because now we're actually measuring what you're burning for fuel. That becomes the key point here.
Yeah, and what's cool about Pinoe, it's portable and it's Wi-Fi, and the data's on your iPhone on an app, and you put it in a backpack, the device. So it's you could do field testing with it if you're just tighten it down. So it'd be interesting.
Sure.
Okay, so running. Let's hop over to running again. What the field test you prefer for running?
Same thing. I'd suggest doing this on a track that you're guaranteeing a flat surface, measured surface. And so you do essentially the same thing as you did for the bike. It's a 20-minute test. You start out conservatively and you maintain fairly steady pace throughout for 20 minutes. And at the end, you do the math to find out what was your average pace. What we really need there is average speed. So if you take the number 60 and divide it by your pace, that gives you speed. So we can wind up then with a pace number and a speed number. And then you go to that chart in table 4.1, I think I said in the book, and it tells you what that works out to be. What if you use that number, what's your pace was for the 100 meters, or
Yeah.
for the 20 minutes rather. That tells you what your zones are. So it's the same thing.
Now, with that though, with all the tests, if so you figure out your 5 zones are a percentage. If you're training, say by the run test, that you're doing a percentage or your set speed, or you're going by heart rate, because I know some people look at their pace that they're trying to hold, and I keep discussing that. Well, don't you want to go by your heart rate because you should be getting faster and not holding yourself back by saying, I'm doing an 800-meter repeat set on the track at 730 pace, which my heart rate over time should keep improving that. It'd be lower at the same pace, right? So would you go by
Well,
heart rate or you go by pace?
yeah, what I do is I have the athlete when they're training in zones 1 and 2. Remember I mentioned a while ago there's a difference between heart rate and power, and
Yes.
heart rate and pace. They're not the same thing. The
Hmm.
difference, one is measuring effort and the other is measuring performance. Well, when we're in zones 1 and 2, we want to be measuring effort. So when I have athletes training zones 1 and 2, we use heart rate. So we've got a heart rate range I want them to stay in throughout the workout. If we're using zones 3, 4, or 5, then I have them using their power meter or or perhaps if they have a speed distance device on for running, they're using that for their speed, measuring their speed on the course or on the run. So it depends. But so if it's zones 1 and 2, I'm using heart rate. So we're going to stay below a certain heart rate. That becomes the way we do it. And I think that puts them in a better position than trying to use pace, because pace, for example, when you run, your heart rate's going to rise gradually over time as fatigue starts to set, it starts to rise. So what I want them to do is when that happens, they got to slow down.
Hmm.
We're trying to stay in zone 2. That means now we need to be slowing down when this is happening. So the pace is not going to stay the same over time. Now, some people can go a long time before pace begins to do this.
Hmm.
A really good athlete can go over an hour before the heart rate starts to rise if they're in zone 2. But somebody who's more of a novice or is not in very good shape, their heart rate is going to start rising really quickly at a very slow speed or power output. So in that case, what I want to do is have them just use the heart rate. And in that case, power and pace become like interesting information, but we're not going to use it to determine how fast we're going in this workout.
Your pace. Got it. And that's where I think it's important to use a system as training peaks, because you can have that data connected to your, say I use a Garmin and I can analyze clients' workouts on Training Peaks, click the button that says analyze, and you can see all that data and you can
Right.
enter in all their field testing on their settings so you can track and then update them when you do retesting.
Right. Yeah. Then there's one very critical piece of information. We're talking about heart rate and power and heart rate and pace. There's one very critical piece of information that they ought to be checking every day after a workout, especially zone 1, 2 workouts. This
Uh-huh.
is like the starting place for analyzing your workout. It's called efficiency factor, or on Training Peaks, it shows up on the analysis tab as EF,
Mm.
efficiency factor. What you want to see with that number is it should be rising over time. So if you do a zone 2 workout today, what I want to do is have you go back and look and see what your EF is for today, your efficiency factor for today. It'd be like something like maybe 1.2 or something like that. Go back and see what that same number for what for the same type of workout 8 weeks ago, what was your EF?
Mm.
And every time
Okay.
you do a zone 2 workout, look at your EF and go back 8 weeks and compare it with 8 weeks ago for the very same type of workout. What should happen over time is that EF should be rising. So let's say this time it was 1.2 and you go back 8 weeks and you find it was 1.05.
Mm.
Great, perfect. That means you're becoming more aerobically fit. It's an easy way of seeing if your aerobic fitness is improving or not.
Okay.
It's,
I was trying to
all you
look
have
it
to do is
up.
compare numbers.
Okay. And then also recovery, we look at heart rate variability. And I know Garmin or the Training Peaks will give you different numbers. We can use Garmin or use Training Peaks on the metrics to track recovery. Is there other things that we can use?
Yeah, well, HRV is one of the best to use. You know, you can use that with your Garmin or any number of other devices. What I do, for example, every morning when I get up, first thing I do is get out of bed, I make a cup of coffee, don't drink any yet, but get a cup of coffee made, slowly move out to the patio where we sit down, my wife and I sit down and we start to read the news for the day. So I check, you know, I spend just a few minutes just kind of doing normal sorts of things so I get my heart rate to slow down and get
Well,
really
wait,
calm.
shouldn't you just read happy news though? So you have to choose what news you're reading because that could
I start
impact your
the
results.
news, yeah, the news I start off with is the weather.
Oh,
So I start to see what's the weather going to be for today? What's the weather going to be for the rest of the week? That day, if we're going on a trip someplace, what's the weather going to be wherever we're going? What's the weather where my son lives? What's the weather where my granddaughter lives? And so we do all this sort of thing. That takes about 5 minutes. So now I'm calmed down. And so now I check my HRV
okay.
in its calm state. And after I get this HRV, then it's uploaded to my Training Peaks account. And so I've got the data collected. And it's also the same with heart rate. It's taking my heart rate at the same time. And that data winds up in my Training Peaks account. So I've got two indicators of what's going on with my body. They're both interesting. They don't always agree. Sometimes I'll get a real low HRV, which is bad, and I'll have a normal heart rate, which is
Mm.
good. Or the other way around, or I'll get a high heart rate and a normal HRV. But you got to kind of learn how your body responds to life. It's not perfect. You can't take either of these numbers and say, well, that means today I should do this. It just means if you get low HRV, which means your sympathetic nervous system is being stressed somewhat. If you get that, then you might say to yourself, well, maybe what I should do today is pay attention to how I feel on this ride or this swim or this run. How do I feel? Am I feeling okay? Or is there something that's going on here that I'm not, that maybe says I should back off? So it's just kind of a warning sign. It doesn't mean stop and don't do anything. It just means red flag.
Mm-hmm.
Pay attention. So
Yep.
that's the way to
Engine
look at
light
both
on.
these numbers. Yeah. If you do that, you'll be fine.
What program do you like to use for heart rate variability testing?
I use the Garmin, and I use it's my wristwatch. My Garmin attaches to HRV for training, it's called, which is the
Yep.
website. That 4 is a number 4, HRV for training. And I've been using that now for, I don't know, a few years. But there are
Hmm.
lots of others out there. I don't know all the others, but there are others out there. I started using that one right off the bat because I knew the guy who has the website. And I like his work and his how he puts a lot of effort in making sure things are done well. So I use that one, but there are lots of others out there also.
Well, I like to use heart rate variability, especially in the morning, and I like to know also the breakdown of heart rate variability, so we can see the LF to low frequency to high frequency, the breakdown of your heart rate variability. So it's not just the number, but let's see the balance of your nervous system. Does yours
Yeah,
say the LF and HF score? Can you get the raw data basically?
yeah, it can. Quite honestly, I don't pay much attention to it. I just look to see what the data is, the basic number, the base number. What is
Yep.
my HRV for the day? What's my heart rate for the day? And that becomes the flag in my head that I can even pay attention to sometimes. But you can dig into it lots deeper as you can with almost anything in sport. All the data we've been talking about so far, power meters and so forth, you can dig into that really deep also. But for whatever reason, I don't do it with HRV. I do it with power meters, but I don't do it with HRV.
Hmm. I do it with too much of everything. I was curious, rabbit holes. So this is, I was just looking at the app, and this is the one that you put your finger up to it,
Right.
HRV for training.
That's
Okay,
one way of doing
yeah,
it. You can also use
looked
a
at.
chest strap.
Not the, oh, okay. Because it says VO2 max estimation for runners, training peaks, training
Yeah,
polarization analysis, lactate threshold estimation, Strava or training
yeah,
peaks. Huh,
yeah.
interesting.
It's pretty general. I don't know how accurate all that stuff is. Like, what's your VO2 max? I don't know how accurate that is. It's kind of like, I've got three devices that tell me my VO2 max, and none of them are the same. I get different
No,
numbers every one of them.
yeah.
And there's
And
quite a variance between the three of them also.
well, yeah, like I say, all this is baseline data and just kind of get a template of, picture snapshot of where you are today so you can have goals and measurement so you can improve. I think that's the whole thing I keep saying with VO2 max is just a number. We want to know how to improve it. So it's not, oh, here's your VO2 max, it's 46. But I need a plan if I want to get it to 55 or 50 and improve it. So it's figuring out how best to personalize the program so you can improve that number, not just knowing your VO2 max, like big whoop to me. It's like, yeah, it's great, but how am I going to get it better? That's really the juicy part we want to dive into.
It's the same with all data. Actually, the reason for looking at data is to see what can I do to improve.
Yeah.
Um, you don't look at data just to see data. We look at data to make plans for how to get ahead
Mm-hmm.
of the game. So it's these are all good tools. There's so many anymore, and we're probably just at the very cusp of an overwhelming amount of information coming our way in the not too distant future. I expect to see like lactate testers
Yeah.
that you put on your arm, and while you're running or running or riding your bike rather, it tells you what your lactate is right now. Um, that's the sort of thing we're going to see probably coming up next.
Mhm.
And there's more. There's just a whole line of things being worked on, I'm sure, to overwhelm us with information.
Yeah. Overwhelm. I know. Sometimes just keep it simple is easier. Less is more.
Could be.
Just intuition. Let's go back to that.
Yeah.
So good deal. Well, thank you so much for your time today. And let's tell everyone again your website and where to buy your book.
Yeah, you can go to joefrieltraining.com, and that's my blog site. And I also have their all my books and how you can purchase them. So
Great.
um, thanks again for having me on board. I enjoyed the conversation. This is always fun to talk about this kind of stuff for me. Hope we get something good out of it for your listeners also.
Yeah. Thanks for geeking out and sharing the information to clarify how to do it right. Good.